It's 5 p.m. here in Lagos, Nigeria. Welcome to the World Today. I'm Layo Olarinde. Here's what's coming up on the program. Russia's Kremlin says President Vladimir Putin is ready to talk to U.S. President Donald Trump over the ongoing war in Ukraine. President Trump orders plan for release of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King assassination files. Plus, 2 rare red weather warnings in place in Northern Ireland and Scotland. We begin the program with the war in Ukraine and U.S. President Donald Trump's efforts in ending the war. President Trump is reiterating his warning of imposing high tariffs and further sanctions on Russia if Vladimir Putin fails to end the war in Ukraine. Writing on his social media platform, Truth Social, he said that by pushing to settle the war, he was doing Russia and its president a very big favor. On Thursday, he said he was ready to meet with Putin as soon as possible to secure an end to the war with Ukraine and also expressed a desire to work towards cutting nuclear arms.
They have a lot of power over Russia. They supply energy to Russia, and Russia supplies energy to them. They supply other things to, It's really a very big trade. It's a very big trading partner. But Russia supplies a lot of energy to China. China pays them a lot of money for that. And I think they have a lot of power over Russia. So I think Russia should want to make a deal. Maybe they want to make a deal. I think from what I hear, Putin would like to see me, and we'll meet as soon as we can. I'd meet immediately. Every day we don't meet, soldiers are being killed in a battlefield. And that battlefield is like no battlefield since World War II. That's it. And I have pictures that you don't want to see. Soldiers are being killed on a daily basis at numbers that we haven't seen in decades. And it'd be nice to end that war. It's a ridiculous war.
Well, responding to this, the Kremlin said Russian President Vladimir Putin is actually ready to hold a phone call with U.S. President Donald Trump, and Moscow is waiting for word from Washington that it is ready as well. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov also said on Friday that the conflict in Ukraine is about Russia's national security and not about oil prices after U.S. President Donald Trump called for a cut in the price of oil. Peskov said the issues for Russia and Ukraine are about national security, threats to Russians living there, and the refusal of the US and Europe to listen to Russia's concerns. Russia also says it is open to negotiating nuclear disarmament and will engage with Washington, but only if the nuclear arsenals of the UK and France are included. In domestic U.S. issues, President Donald Trump has ordered officials to make plans to declassify documents related to 3 of the most consequential assassinations in U.S. history: the killings of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. Mr. Trump told reporters in the Oval Office on Thursday that a lot of people are waiting for this for years, and everything will be revealed. The order directs top administration officials to present a plan to declassify the documents within 15 days. Mr. Trump promised to declassify all of the files in his first term, but held back on his promise after the CIA and FBI officials persuaded him to keep some files secret. Thursday's executive order states that continued secrecy is not consistent with the public interest. President John F. Kennedy was killed in Dallas in 1963. His brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was assassinated while running for president in California in 1968. And just 2 months after, Martin Luther King Jr., America's most famous civil rights leader, was murdered in Memphis, Tennessee. Many of the documents related to the investigations have been released in the years since, although thousands still remain redacted, particularly related to the sprawling JFK investigation. On the Birthright citizenship debacle, a federal judge in Seattle has blocked President Donald Trump's administration from implementing an executive order curtailing the right to automatic birthright citizenship in the U.S. The judge calls it blatantly unconstitutional. U.S. District Judge John Lunar, at the urging of 4 Democratic-led states, issued a temporary restraining order preventing the administration from enforcing the order, which the Republican president signed on Monday. The order has already become the subject of 5 lawsuits by civil rights groups and Democratic attorneys general from 22 states who call it a flagrant violation of the U.S. Constitution. Washington Assistant Attorney General Lane Polozola urged the judge to issue a temporary restraining order to prevent the Trump administration from carrying out this key element of the immigration crackdown. The challengers argue that Trump's action violates the right enshrined in the Citizenship Clause of the Constitution's 14th Amendment that provides that anyone born in the U.S. is a citizen.
That the court saw the seriousness and the urgency of the complaint and request for a temporary restraining order brought by the state of Washington, Oregon, Arizona, and Illinois, and are thrilled that the judge issued a temporary restraining order directing the United States government to take no further action in enforcing and implementing the unconstitutional and un-American executive order attempting to eliminate birthright citizenship in America. This is step one. But to hear the judge from the bench say that in his 40 years as a judge, he has never seen something so blatantly unconstitutional sets the tone for the seriousness of this effort. Well, in order to amend the United States Constitution, there is a pretty well laid out process to do that. And I think what the order today reinforces is that no one individual, not even the President of the United States, can simply erase what it means to amend the Constitution and the process therein. If Congress wanted to move to take action and the states wanted to ratify something that amended the United States Constitution, they could certainly take that action. This is a nationwide order. It essentially directs the United States government to take no further action in implementing the president's unconstitutional order. Well, as we laid out today, so we moved for a temporary restraining order, which has a nationwide impact. The next step will be a preliminary injunction, which will allow for more thorough briefing. The TRO that was issued today has a 14-day effective date. So for 14 days, the United States government can take no further action implementing or enforcing this order. Well, we will be back in court, as will many other people across the country.
Well, speaking of actions in court, President Trump says his administration will be appealing the decision by the judge to temporarily block the executive order restricting birthright citizenship. The executive order had directed U.S. agencies to refuse to recognize the citizenship of children born in the United States if neither their mother nor father is a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident. The judge, an appointee of Republican former President Ronald Reagan, dealt the first legal setback to these hardline policies on immigration that are a centerpiece of Trump's second term as president. The order was slated to take effect in February.
Okay, no, obviously we'll appeal it. They put it before a certain judge in Seattle, I guess, right? And there's no surprises with that judge.
Well, speaking more on the executive orders by the president, he has also pardoned 23 anti-abortion activists, including some convicted of blockading a reproductive health clinic and intimidating staff and patients. The pardons were issued a day before March for Life, that's an annual anti-abortion rally in Washington, D.C. President Trump is expected to address that march via video link. It's America's largest annual anti-abortion rally. In 2020, he became the first U.S. president to attend the rally in person. Previous Republican presidents, including George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, have addressed the group remotely, and the annual demonstration first began in 1974, a year after the U.S. Supreme Court legalized abortion in Roe v. Wade. Now, Roe v. Wade was a landmark 1973 legal ruling that made abortion legal across the U.S., but it was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2022.
A set of pardons for peaceful pro-life protesters who were prosecuted by the Biden administration for exercising their First Amendment rights.
Do you know how many?
I believe it's 23, sir.
23 people were prosecuted. They should not have been prosecuted. Many of them are elderly people. They should not have been prosecuted. This is a great honor to sign this.
To global trade matters, China has been offered some breathing room from President Donald Trump's tariffs, prompting some analysts to ask if the U.S. president has gone soft on China. But this approach is also keeping Beijing guessing. Trump has described the tariffs as Washington's one very big power over China, so he sees them as a key diplomatic tool to do a deal. In response, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has once again warned in its daily briefing that there will be no winners in a trade war and that Beijing is ready to talk to the U.S. to properly handle the differences. The ministry adds that there are no winners in trade and tariff wars following President Trump's comments that his conversation with Chinese President Xi Jinping last week was friendly and he thought he could reach a trade deal with Beijing. In the meantime, a supply chain analyst says U.S. President Donald Trump's threat of imposing a 10% tariff on imports from China is a good thing to set the stage for further trade negotiations between Washington and Beijing. Now, since taking office, President Trump has spoken about a 10% punitive duty on Chinese imports because he says fentanyl is being sent from China to the U.S. via Mexico and Canada. However, he did not immediately impose tariffs as he had promised during his election campaign. Even so, senior partner at Tidal Wave Solutions, Cameron Johnson, believes the move is unlikely to move supply chains out of China, as Chinese supply chains are more resilient than the American counterparts at this point.
Anything is possible with the Trump administration, but at the moment I think it's actually a good thing that they're going after 10% to kind of set the stage of we are serious, but we also want to work something out. I think if the U.S. does not necessarily get what it needs, you will start to see a ratcheting up of tariffs until it becomes too painful and then something is done to take those tariffs away. So 10% won't really lead to anything outside, any supply chains moving outside of China, partly because China has already done a lot of de-risking in the last 6-7 years because of the trade war. So Chinese supply chains are actually much more resilient than American supply chains at this point. If it goes above 10%, you will see more companies either shift further into Southeast Asia particularly, or drive an automation and robotics to kind of cut cost as quickly as possible. The U.S. is using tariffs as a point that this is a serious issue for us. And in reality, there's more Americans that die between the age of 18 and 50 of fentanyl than almost any other cause. So this is a serious political issue in the United States. So Trump wants to go in and show how serious it is, not just the Chinese, but also to the domestic audience, that he's trying to do something to stop the flow. I think what it does also do is it sets the stage for further negotiations, such as, does the U.S. have more DEA agents in the country to help go after some of these, illicit procurement operations, things like that.
Let's speak now to our Washington, D.C. correspondent, Maria Bird, for more on the domestic issues in the U.S. Hello, Maria. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
An avalanche of activities we have seen from President Donald Trump since he took office. No surprise there, isn't it, for Americans especially?
You're exactly correct. There was no surprise regarding the executive orders that were expected. Prior to the inauguration, it was expected that we would see multiple executive orders. At one point was said could be close to 1,000. I don't think we've seen that many, but I do know that we have seen quite a few. The challenge I think that many Americans are looking at is that the type of executive orders are going to create major changes in the United States. I know you're going to talk a little bit about the Birthright Acts and the lawsuits around that, but some of those executive executive orders that are addressing DEI, some of those very clear changes that are a complete opposite of the previous administration are definitely going to be challenges potentially here in the United States. But again, the hope is that this will allow for obviously growth in the U.S. economy and also some areas that I think many people were looking to address, and even the previous administration as well.
Yes, you're correct. Just before we move to the birthright citizenship, let's help us understand the latest orders he has signed. And I'm talking about the declassification of documents on the JFK, RFK, and MLK murders. Isn't this opening a can of worms? How is this expected to play out?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, there's a potential for a can of worms, as you stated, that could be opened. What we know here in the United States is that oftentimes what we call cold cases are reopened when there's new evidence brought forth. And so that's not something unlike and unusual for the United States. I think the real challenge here is around the individuals that we're opening the case for, and no one has had the interest nor the courage, to be very honest, because of the high level individuals that you are talking about opening these cases for. When you talk about MLK Jr., you talk about Martin Luther King Jr., what he did for the United States, and especially around the civil rights movement, opening that case up to discuss how he was killed, exactly all of what the back pieces to that, if the FBI was involved in that, I think is going to definitely create, obviously, mixed opinions, mixed feelings. But for the family, you know, they have obviously been for many years, over 50 years, waiting to find out the truth around the killing of their father. So I think that as you mentioned, it opens a can of worms, but it also could provide resolve to many families, but to Americans as a whole. And then you look at the former president of the United States, JFK, who was tragically killed, and that case being reopened will obviously provide some consolence to the Kennedy family, but also Americans. There were many Americans that loved President Kennedy and that were huge supporters of his. So I think it'll also provide great comfort as well, and provide some resolution to, I think, what has been kind of questionable, what really happened, was there government involvement, was there truth around this? And then, as you stated, RFK, I mean, he was looking to become the next president, the brother of JFK in that killing. But we also know there's obviously a close connection with the Kennedy family at this time, or at least with Robert F. Kennedy's son, who is actually going to be serving a part of the Trump administration, which obviously was very interesting to see, as they are long-term Democrats, the family is. And so to see the son serving with this administration obviously has brought forth these concerns and brought forth the potential revealing of the truth around these three cases.
Well, Maria, the birthright citizenship, it's one of the most controversial orders that we have that have been signed by the president. We're now seeing lawsuits against it. That was expected. Now, this particular one from the federal judge in Seattle, blocking the administration from implementing the order. But the president has said he will appeal it.
Yes, I think all of this was expected, as you said. I think it was expected that we were going to see court cases brought forth. I mean, that is really, when you think about the structure of the democratic process in the United States and the three branches of government, that is why that is situated in that way. And you have the executive branch who has put forth an order, and now the courts are the ones that provide whether or not that order can be carried out. And so you'll see this go all the way up to the Supreme Court for sure, as it's been stated several times, and as you said, it was expected because it is a constitutional right that is in the Constitution of the United States. And to amend the Constitution, there are several steps to do that. And so as there is a stay at this time, we can expect the appeal from the executive branch from President Trump, and you can then further expect that these cases will be continuing on. It's very likely that we will not see resolve from this, and that if this executive order was to ever move forward, that it will be quite some time, just due to the number of cases that are brought forth and the process that has to take place at this time.
All right, Maria, just bring us up to speed on the illegal migration crackdown. We understand about 10,000 troops will be sent to the U.S.-Mexico border.
Yes, ICE obviously was another area that we knew was going to be imminent upon the new president's administration. We knew that he would be doing raids in communities to ensure that illegal immigrants were not in the U.S., especially those who potentially had legal challenges previously. Obviously, the border issues, there were various asylum programs that were put in place by the Biden administration that he has ended. And so he wants to ensure that those individuals are not able to cross over. And there are thousands of people that have the ability, due to some of the terrain there at the border, some of the challenges around security. We know that President Trump previously, in his previous administration, had talked about a border wall. There is no wall there. And so it does make potential access for people to cross the border illegally. But those 10,000 troops are obviously there to ensure the areas around the terrain and the areas that are hard to see and that are not well protected will have troops there. So we will see how this ends up impacting the number of individuals that are crossing over into the United States illegally, but also this is going to drastically increase even those who are applying to come into the U.S. because many of the asylum programs have now ended.
All right, Maria, just finally before I let you go, the president gave his first speech to global leaders, albeit remotely, since taking office at the Davos summit that's ending today. How did Americans perceive his address?
Well, I think that many Americans, especially, you think of America, the majority of Americans, especially when you look at the way in which our voting system is structured, voted for the president. And so you do have a very large percentage that are looking for him to address the economy. That is really the number one thing I think that all Americans are looking for, is addressing the economy. The tariff piece, depending on where you sit on the political side of the house, might not be what you believe will address the economic challenges, but there are many Americans that were happy to hear him mention the tariff that he looks to potentially implement. We're happy to hear him requesting that manufacturing happens in the U.S. And for the goods that are sold in the U.S. And so I think really around bringing back productivity into the U.S., really looking at how protecting, I think, the economic structure of the U.S. and looking at trade relationships in the U.S. I think you have some that are concerned that these trade conversations and what he has said could be a bit strong, but there are others that believe that this strength that he's showing through what he stated at the World Economic Forum will allow countries to potentially renegotiate some of the trade deals that the U.S. has with them.
All right, thank you so much, Maria Bird, our Washington, D.C. correspondent. Thank you. U.S. President Donald Trump's massive $500 billion AI investment has added to the buzz at the World Economic Forum, which wraps up on Friday. President Trump said that ChatGPT's creator, OpenAI, SoftBank, and Oracle are planning a joint venture called Stargate, which he said will build data centers and create more than 100,000 jobs in the United States. So joining us with more about how that has been received in Europe is DW correspondent Chiponda Chimbelu in Berlin. Hello, Chiponda. Thank you for your time. So what has been the reaction so far to this?
Well, the tech industry has welcomed U.S. President Trump's AI investment, which is, of course, being called the Stargate project. Now, this is not just about the infrastructure and funding for AI that is being unlocked. There's also a change in the regulatory environment. President Trump revoked Biden's 2023 executive order, which regulated the risks of AI. Now, in it, Biden required AI model developers to share the results of safety tests before they were launched to address privacy and security concerns. Now, Trump has reversed that, and now there's fewer restrictions and more money for artificial intelligence in the United States. Now, that is something that could also benefit the AI industry in other countries too, because it will put pressure on other governments to act.
Now, where does this leave, the European Union's AI ambition?
It will be very difficult for the EU to keep up. What Brussels is planning in terms of funding pales in comparison to the $500 billion over the next 4 years in the Stargate project. Now, last month, the EU announced a plan to invest 1.5 billion euros. That is a drop in the ocean compared to Stargate. And AI players in Europe have been complaining about the regulatory environment too. Last year, the EU Parliament passed a landmark law to regulate artificial intelligence, and while the law is meant to protect EU citizens, companies have been complaining about it. Smaller firms are worried about compliance costs, and big tech giants like Facebook and Apple have been holding off releasing AI features in the EU over fears they could face hefty fines if they do not comply with the bloc's rules. So it will be interesting to see how Brussels responds.
Well, as we await that response, will AI now widen inequality between the different regions?
Well, the Stargate project shows just how much the US could be racing ahead in AI. And one study showed that at the end of 2023, a total of 67.2 billion euros, or rather dollars, was privately invested in AI in the United States. Now, that is nearly 9 times more than the amount invested in China, which was in second place. And the United States is already home to many AI players. So it will be very difficult for other markets to catch up. And in the EU, it's not just about funding or regulation being a challenge. AI needs data centers that require huge amounts of energy. Europe has struggled to find alternatives to cheap Russian gas, and experts, of course, are also concerned about the differences in levels of investment in AI between wealthy countries and poorer ones, so they fear that that might intensify global inequalities. Poor countries will, of course, struggle to raise the funds required for their economies to benefit from AI, and they won't be able to adequately reskill workforces. So that, of course, may also contribute to inequality.
All right, thank you very much, Chiponda Chibelu. Well, we're back here in Africa as the world continues to evolve. So do the challenges nations face, particularly on the continent where protests have become an essential mechanism for addressing deep-rooted socio-political and economic issues. These protests have played a vital role in shaping the political landscape across the continent, highlighting both the urgent demands for change and the complex dynamics that contribute to the unrest. A new report called Protests in Africa, a Decade of Dissent, Economic Impact and Legal Development explores the causes and impacts of these protests, examining how they have shaped governance, human rights and economic stability. The report says Africa can harness the transformative potential of its protest movements for a more just and equitable future by addressing these underlying issues and fostering collaboration and strategies. Joining us now for more on this is Temitope Olodo, the CEO, TRAS Intelligence and Security Solutions. Thank you for joining us on The World Today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, let's begin with more on this report. Tell us more about it and how, it affects the average African.
Yeah, thank you so much. Once again, the report itself is a 10-year throwback looking at protests since 2014 to date. And what we have noticed is a dynamic shift in the way we do protests. The normal protest that most Africans are aware of is the one on the street. But we've seen a shift. We've seen a digital mobilization. We've seen people sitting at home. It's not just about people carrying sticks and walking down the street anymore. It is now protests where people are actually expressing their grievances, and it has affected a lot of Africans because they've lost money, people have lost their income, businesses have closed up as a result of protests, maybe destruction. We saw that in Kenya, where actually youth went on rampage and went into parliament, something that have never happened before. But it's not just restricted to Africa. Look, we saw similar approach adopted even in America and even in the United Kingdom, where actually people went on a day of rampage. So protest is dynamic. Africans are being affected either from a political perspective as Africans, economically, and also from a social-political. It is changing the shift or the landscape in Africa, and we really need to look into it and look at the lessons learned from some of the protests and see how we could improve the lives of ordinary Africans.
Well, protests is a right of the people. But for years, we have
Definitely.
seen African governments crack down on protests, whatever form it may be. Can African governments think differently when it comes to protests?
Yes, they should think differently and they should act differently. It's important for there to be a mind shift where African leaders are more importantly, what you call security officials who are advising African leaders need to let them know that we need to change our mindset in the way we view protests. Protest is grievances. People have grievances, and because they do not have a route through which they can, channels through which they can lay their grievances, or they are not aware of those routes, people will tend to go for protest, and protest comes in different form. But if leaders look at protest as a democratic right, so if we look at Nigeria, for example, even the current president of Nigeria, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, was a protester at one point and he had to go on exile. So if there's anybody that needs to even be the father of protest, he should even be dropping his agbada and actually going on the street to join the protesters for their right. So we should look at it as a democratic right. But more importantly, there should be an engagement. Because if there is a proactive engagement with protesters, they will be able to deal with it. And like I mentioned earlier, protest is coming in different forms. It could be that people on the internet decide to boycott businesses. It could be that it could be the cities at home. And we've seen the impact of it, even when it's meant to be a non-violent protest or sit at home. Billions was lost. And without the effective engagement by government, what we saw is that it was hijacked by other, unknown government, unknown institutions, and used it against government and the people. So government need to engage. Government need to look at protests from a different perspective, from a 21st century perspective. Protests have been happening since the time of Pharaoh. So we need to look at it. Before independence, there were protests which led to change of government, and now there are protests that are even turning around to become militarized, and we need to engage more to ensure that that does not happen.
Indeed, you've touched a little bit on my next question. Some agitations sometimes become hijacked, like you've mentioned, and the intended purpose is lost, and then there is chaos. Are there ways to protect these demonstrations so that they're not overtaken by unscrupulous elements?
Definitely, there are ways, there are legislations, although there are many colleagues, out there within the security and legal, environment that will say that we have enough legislation. But I am of the view that, if you want to hold 1 or 2 days of protest and you've informed the police, of course, it's your right to protest. You could engage with the police, they could know your routes, and then they could advise based on intelligence that, okay, if you want to take route A, we'll advise that you take route B instead, because route A could lead to more violence. So there should be an engagement between the people organizing the protest. If it's a large protest, if it's a minor protest like the one we saw in Ibadan recently, a few days ago, which is to do with 80 days of non-electricity provided to the medical industry, you could see that people protested easily and went back, and they met with the government officials. They took their protest and they said they're taking it to the government. No problem there. That's the kind of protest we want. But when it's a large one, government need to engage with government, and it needs to be properly managed. Otherwise, it will lead to chaos.
And perhaps there are better ways of airing grievances rather than protesting out on the streets. Do you think?
Yes, definitely. There are different ways, and I think that most of those institutions putting this kind of protest together could look at using digital means, technology to be able to put their grievances forward. We know that there's members of parliament either across Africa that you could go to your house of member of parliament. In the UK, most people use digital means by going online to lay their protest and claim 500 people want this change. And when government see those kind of things, government don't play with numbers because they know that could affect their political chances. So yeah, there are different ways that we could adopt, and we have put that in our report, which you could see on our Trans website. Organizations, different stakeholders could engage with us, and we could advise them, both police in the way to modern way of policing protests, so that people will know that they are there to protect them and to ensure that it doesn't become violent, and for businesses also to identify different ways in which they could be in support. But I think it's important to also recognize the dynamics of the global impact on conflicts or on protests of this nature, because even the diaspora now are getting involved in protests and giving money and giving logistic, and we don't want a situation that we saw in Nigeria where young children were collapsing in courtrooms. That should not be the case, and everybody needs to be speaking to each other to ensure that this kind of things do not happen, and protest is better managed in 2025, and that's the reason why we've written the report, which is a 10-year study, which more or less indicated that over 254,000 people lost their life, and political protests alone saw the highest number of casualty of 83,000. That's a lot of people that do not need to lose their life, and we need to start engaging. Government need to engage, protesters need to engage, and government need to listen to the people more.
All right, then. Thank you so much, Temitope Olodo, the CEO, Trans Intelligence and Security Solutions. Thank you for your time on the program.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, let's check in with the World Economic Forum that's closing today in Davos, Switzerland. The World Trade Organization chief is warning that trade wars would be catastrophic and have catastrophic consequences for global growth. WTO DG Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala spoke in a World Economic Forum session on trade, where U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff threats were discussed. EU Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis, who also attended the event, said Trump should address income inequality rather than look to tariffs to solve political problems in the U.S.
One, domestic consumption. If we have tit-for-tat retaliation, whether it's 25%, tariff 60%, and we go to where we were in the 1930s, we're going to see double-digit global GDP losses. Double digit. That's catastrophic. Everyone will pay. Everyone. And the poor countries will pay even more. Second, if we just do not quite tit for tat, but even a version of that, let's say we break into two trading blocks and, we're not trading across the world, and we layer in trade policy uncertainty. We've done that work too. We're going to lose 6.4% of real global GDP in the longer term. That's like losing the economy of Japan and Korea.
Also in attendance at the World Economic Forum was Botswana's new president, Duma Boko, who says he hopes to clinch a long-delayed sales pact with industry giant De Beers as early as this week. Diamond reached Botswana and De Beers agreed on a new pact in 2023, which would see the government's shares of diamonds from the Botswana joint venture gradually increased to 50% over the next decade, but it was never signed under President Boko's predecessor Mogweti Masisi. Botswana currently sells 75% of its output to De Beers, in which Botswana owns a 15% stake. The country is the world's leading diamond producer by value. Mr. Boko also spoke about the urgent need to address unemployment in Botswana and the need to diversify the country's economy.
And it is to be expected that Botswana and its partner will negotiate and try and reach some sensible agreement that serves both parties. We've had a long partnership with De Beers, and we hope that partnership continues into the future, and we look forward to that happening. On most of the issues, we are in agreement. I think it was just tidying up. Hopefully, we should get it over the line.
The International Criminal Court prosecutor has applied for arrest warrants for Taliban leaders in Afghanistan, including the Supreme Spiritual Leader Haibatullah, accusing them of crimes against humanity for widespread discrimination against women and girls. A statement issued by the Office of the Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan said evidence collected as part of investigations provided reasonable grounds to believe that these men bear criminal responsibility for the crime against humanity of prosecution on gender grounds. Mr. Khan says they are criminally responsible for persecuting Afghan girls and women from at least 15th of August 2021 until the present day across the territory of Afghanistan. The Afghan probe is one of the longest by the ICC and has been beset by legal and practical delays. The initial preliminary examination started in 2007, and it was only in 2022 that a full-scale investigation has moved forward.
After a thorough investigation, and on the basis of evidence collected, my office submits that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the Supreme Leader of the Taliban, Haibatullah Akhundzada, and the Chief Justice of the so-called Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, Abdul Hakim Haqqani, bear criminal responsibility for the crime against humanity of persecution on gender grounds under Article 71H of the Rome Statute. My office has concluded that these two Afghan nationals are criminally responsible for persecuting Afghan girls and women, as well as persons whom the Taliban perceived are not conforming with their ideological expectations of gender identity or expression, and persons whom the Taliban perceived as allies of girls and women.
Indonesian rescuers at a landslide site have had to pause their search efforts in Pekalongan, Central Java province. The bad weather in the region is hampering rescue efforts even as the death toll rises to at least 25 people. That toll increased from 17 on Tuesday when torrential rain in the city of Pekalongan triggered the landslide. Hundreds of rescuers were deployed to the area. Earlier this week, rescuers were spraying water to clear the debris and unearthing items such as motorcycles buried in the mud. A rare red weather warning is in place for Scotland as Storm Eowyn battles the UK and Ireland. Almost 1 million customers are without power across the island of Ireland, including 240,000 in Northern Ireland, where a red warning ended this afternoon. The red warning in place means there is a danger to life. In the Republic of Ireland, 725,000 customers are without electricity. Earlier, a record gust of 114 meters per hour was recorded at Mace Head. Millions of people are being urged to stay at home across the UK, and travel disruption is widespread with roads blocked by fallen trees, flights cancelled, and rail services halted. And the rare deep freeze in the wake of an historic winter storm that swept across the U.S. South this week is to linger through Sunday. Parts of New York's Hudson River, like you can see, turned to ice also during recent cold weather in the city. The frozen surface split into ice blocks with the city's face skyline seen in the background of the river.
Oh, there you go. Okay, Julia, you got it.
An exciting music at the Davos summit. Cellist Yo-Yo Ma gave an outdoor performance dedicated to glaciers on Thursday as political and business leaders were gathering just down the mountain for the World Economic Forum. The performance in the Swiss ski resort town was part of the Performing Hope climate change initiative from Arctic Base Camp. The world-famous cellist performed 3 pieces in cold and snowy conditions on a mountain just above Davos. By Performing Hope, the organizers behind the initiative, which was launched in Davos in 2024, believe the emotional energy needed facing the challenges of a climate crisis can be generated.
The performing arts is a way of combining knowledge and the human experience in a way that moves us so deeply, in a way that science or language can never quite do. So for me, the performing arts actually is the perfect antidote to the climate crisis that we're facing right now. And these really strong crosswinds coming from governments around the world, coming from businesses that are backsliding. I think we need the performing arts to get us in the right place. Davos is of course where the World Economic Forum has its annual meeting, and it's also a spectacular landscape. But inside the Congress Center or down on the promenade, you see it a little bit, but mostly you don't. You go back into these closed-door discussions where politics or economics or power and greed come to the forefront. And we wanted to be at Davos because that's where power is. So we can, of course, reach people in a different way because they've all gathered here. But to have our event outside in the magnificence of nature is to remind people that regardless of what they're discussing in those closed doors, this is really what's happening.
And finally on the program, Shanghai's Eowyn garden is lit up with colorful lanterns ahead of the Lunar New Year. A large snake lantern with a moving head is displayed in the main square as lanterns of flowers, butterflies, and mythical creatures decorate the vicinity. Park visitors enjoyed the festive atmosphere with some wearing traditional outfits or cosplay. The installations will be on display until the 12th of February.
好了，前面走了，看好了。这个更黑了，不行。
真，你看这个有点那个，这个有点那梦幻的感觉，不要怕。走啊，往前走。
And that's it on the program for today and for the week. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Layo Olarinde. Have a lovely weekend.